Hey fearsome friends, it's 80 degrees and above outside, and I'm beginning to melt. But these chilling deep wood stories have cooled me down some. So sit back, relax, get cozy, comfy, warm, because it's time to let your nightmares in. Years ago, my family and I, with some family friends, went camping at some cabins at Lake Placid. But despite what happened that weekend, that campground holds very fond memories for me that I will cherish forever. The incident happened on the 4th of July weekend, when my family was grilling food and my friends and I, children at the time, were running around playing cops and robbers. While we played, the campground owner came over to my parents and offered to pay for some food. My parents, though, being the nice people they are, just gave him food and beer for free. However, eventually the owner had overstayed his welcome and was asked to leave by my friend's dad. This angered him, and he took off his shirt and tried to fight him. We weren't aware that he was an alcoholic, though, and had already drunk a lot when he'd asked for food and beer. They thankfully eventually got him to leave, but he came back, this time with a rifle. As me and my friends played, he staggered around drunkenly trying to load his rifle, when one of my friends, being an innocent kid, walked over to him and asked him what he was doing. The owner said, "I'm going to show your dad something." One of the adults saw this and rushed over, and my friend's dad took the rifle from his hands and threw it across the parking lot and screamed at him that there were kids around. At this point I knew something bad was happening, and I rushed all my friends inside our cabin. My dad then called the police and was recording the whole thing, and when the police eventually came, they arrested him for the night, while the campground owner tried to claim he never had a rifle, while saying on the video, "Give me my rifle." The police came back the next morning and let us file a temporary restraining order while we stayed the weekend. Now, while this is an incident my family laughs at from time to time, I can't help wonder what would have happened if he had gotten that rifle loaded. First of all, I don't know if this will be scary to you. It was for me when it happened, and I still get frightened when I remember it. I can assure you that this story is 100% true. So it starts in 2012, when I was 15 years old. 3 of my very best friends and I, that I shall call Luke, 17, Lewis, 16, and Gary, 15, one day decided to go camping. And since our dads are all working in the military, we had access to some woods that weren't very far from our homes, 3 miles at most. Of course we weren't trained on anything, but since I'd lived some time in the middle of the Amazon forest, I had confidence that I could handle a night not very far from my house. It was July, winter here in Brazil, and it was really cold, at 5 degrees Celsius, and things were going pretty much as you would expect from a camp in the woods. We were pretty much sat there and chatted until 1 a.m. Then we decided to take shifts in twos to watch out for any animals that could be near. We were afraid of jaguars, but probably the most that could get near us would be some capybaras that are pretty common in the region. At around 4 a.m, Gary, my duo partner, was outside the tent calling for me to stay up with him. But as it was so cold, I wanted to stay inside, saying that no animal would go near us with the noise we were making. After about 5 minutes of back and forth between us, we noticed that we couldn't hear any noise at all, like crickets, owls, and twigs breaking of animals passing by, and a feeling of uneasiness started to grow between us. Now I know this whole thing of no forest noise and yada 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 sounds a little cliché, but I swear this is real when something weird is about to happen. So with this feeling, we stopped arguing and started to pay attention of what was happening around us. We didn't want to wake Luke and Lewis up, because we thought we were just being silly and nothing would happen. But then, from the middle of the woods, we heard a scream. It sounded like a woman, but at the same time it didn't. The scream sounded human, but something was off. It had some kind of animalistic tone behind it. It's really hard to explain. I searched all over the internet and couldn't find any creature that sounded like it, as I firmly believe it wasn't a human screaming. Besides, what woman would be out in the woods at this time of night alone? With the sound, Luke and Lewis woke up a little disorientated, while Gary and I jumped out of the tent and grabbed some sticks, were the only things we could find that would serve as a weapon. Needless to say that we didn't sleep for the rest of the night, as we impatiently awaited for the morning to come. After what looked like hours, but probably was no more than 5 minutes, the forest resumed its regular noises, and we calmed down a little bit. When the sun rose, we packed our things as fast as we could and left, and when we were leaving the forest, we told the military who were guarding the woods what we'd heard, but I'm not really sure if they believed us random teenagers. I'm still friends with those guys that camped with me that night, and every time I see them, I ask if they remember it, and they all say they do. And I still can't imagine what the screaming was, and if we were really in some kind of danger. This may be a ramble of thoughts, but after recently stumbling on this sub, I finally felt I'd found a place I could offer something that my family and I experienced a few years ago, that to this day gives me a shiver. I have been camping, solo backpacking and hunting in Oregon my whole life, so I always felt comfortable in the woods and have a deep respect for nature. A few years ago, my wife, daughter, and 2 German shepherds went camping north of Mount Jefferson, Oregon. Now, our campsite we found to be the perfect setup for us and our 2 dogs, as they needed privacy, since they are intimidating to other dog owners and can be loud when spooked. It wasn't an established campsite though, just a nice area that had flat ground, full trees, and a fire pit. On the first night, my daughter wanted to sleep by herself in a 2-man tent right next to ours. It was maybe 2 feet away from me and my wife's tent, so we made the male German shepherd sleep, Guts is his name, with her in the tent. That whole first night, neither my wife nor I could sleep, as we both heard footsteps and they were heavy. Not like typical forest critters scamping around in the night. I was well armed because I was paranoid from reading recently before departing about a dad in California who was shot and killed in a tent next to his 2 infant daughters. Needless to say, both my wife and I had 2 pistols and my rifle with us. The dogs are great at detection, and that is why I felt my daughter could sleep alone, because Guts is completely fearless and nothing would lay a hand on her without a battle to the death. But all in all, nothing but bad vibes and loud footsteps occurred that night, which I ultimately decided was deer, or maybe just some elk. The next morning we went for a walk down the road, and maybe 300 feet away we saw an abandoned road where a rusted gatepost was covered in vegetation. Then something blue in colour caught my eye, and Guts immediately took off running down this abandoned road. My heart began to race, because I thought it was another family camping like us, and he was going to get himself shot or scare some innocent people to death. So I chased after him as fast as I could, and the rest followed. He stopped after 20 feet into the woods, with me yelling his name, but I have covered just enough distance to see that there is nobody there, and something is off about the sight. I yelled, "Hello, is anyone there? Sorry about the dog." But I got no response. My curiosity got the best of me, and I had to see what the site conditions were. However, as I got closer, I knew something was wrong. It had all the necessities for a campsite, including a cooler, propane burner, tent, blankets, and folding table. but every single item had been completely destroyed, smashed and torn from what appeared to be claw marks. We all walked around in circles, puzzled why anyone would leave all their camping gear behind, including an expensive REI tent. I figured someone must have just left in a hurry, and the animals got to the rest. Still though, a propane tank and cooler had been flattened by something, and it certainly wasn't snowpack with tree coverage in that spot. As the afternoon rolled in, my daughter and I were playing ball at the campsite, and my wife went walking maybe 70 feet north to do her business. I didn't have a direct line of sight on her, but all of a sudden I saw Guts make a mad dash straight towards her. Normally he would always be with me unless he is called over, and she hadn't called for him. His speed and focus caught my attention, and I knew immediately that something weird was happening. So I ran over there myself, and my wife started jogging at me. I drew my pistol, and Guts had continued sprinting into the forest another 100 feet. I called him, and he thankfully stopped. But my other dog, Leah, who never misses the opportunity to be the pack leader, was not taking point. I have had her for 7 years now, and this was the first time in her life she'd refused to leave my daughter's side. She was with full hair raised and attached to us at the hip. Again, any time we hike or play, Leah is up front bossing everything in her path, pauses to look to see where we are, and continues on. I asked my wife what had happened, and she said, "I was trying to pee, when all of a sudden I felt all my hairs rise up. I knew someone was watching me. Then I saw Guts running towards me, and I just got up to move towards you." We spent 10 minutes looking for signs of anything, and saw no trails, broken branches, or anything to point to what and where something went. We decided we were spending one more night, since it was too late to pack up and drive home, but we'd be all in the big tent together. Before we went to bed, I put a rope with a makeshift coin alarm around the perimeter of our campsite, and I used a mint can and some coins and keys from our truck and zip-tied it, so anything hitting the rope gave a little jingle. Very unsophisticated, but it put my wife at ease. As I went to tie my last corner off at a tree near our tent, our third mystery item unveiled itself. It looked like someone had done the same exact thing that I had done with a rope, that was so old and brown I didn't see it at first. It was broken, and only a few pieces remained, but sure enough it was tied at roughly the same height, at 8 to 10 inches off the ground, and even had a few rusted washers on it. I immediately felt someone had stayed here before, and had put the same makeshift warning system on the same tree that I had, maybe 10 to 15 years ago, based on the condition of the rope. Perhaps my paranoia had now reached a new height, but I had to make sure the girls felt we were safe, and at the time the only thing I could think of was when the evening came around, I made them sit in the truck, and I fired a clip of my .45 into the dirt, as a signal to whatever was out there that we were armed. I reassured the girls that anybody listening now knew we had 2 wolves and are armed, and we are too risky of a target, so we can sleep safely. That night we heard no footsteps, and the dogs never perked up or barked. We left early the next morning. Fast forward to today, and I watched the Amazon Missing 411 Hunted documentary, and I noticed the cluster smack dab close to where we camped that weekend, and a flood of dread rushed me as I thought of that mysterious abandoned campsite with the ripped tent and smashed cooler and cooktop. We have been camping since, and have enjoyed the beauty of the Northwest, but there was something there at that place that possibly took or harmed someone else less than 300 feet away from where we'd camped, and we all thank our lucky stars that Guts was doing his thing so well that afternoon. Guts is no longer with us. He has journeyed into the next phase, and there isn't a day that goes by that I don't think about him and how he saved us. He was a warrior, and his new brother Geronimo has his spirit. This happened a few weeks ago to me and my friend. We live on a college campus in a smaller dorm that is right next to a cemetery and some train tracks. From some of our windows you can see the cemetery and tracks, and they are that close. We often walk along the tracks or wander around the cemetery at night for fun, because the tracks aren't active anymore. So one night my friend and I decided to walk along the tracks and smoke a legal substance I had just gotten, wormwood. It's the same stuff they use to flavour absinthe. It's supposed to give you wacky dreams and a mild, relaxed feeling. We were also using one of those crappy legal pens you can buy at any gas station that gets you kind of high. We were trying to get to the train tracks, which were across the street, but ran into a cop. And even though nothing we were doing was illegal, we just didn't want to have to deal with him. So we ended up going on a mile walk, trying to find another way to access the tracks. By this time she was pretty high, and I had taken a few hits of the pen, but was feeling nothing. I have a pretty high tolerance, especially for those pen things. And also, yes, this is important to the story. We finally found an entrance to the tracks through a hole in the fence of a parking lot very close to our dorm. As we were walking along the dimly lit rows of cars, we then got to the entrance to the tracks, and saw how it immediately went into a very dark, densely wooded area, with large embankments on either side of the railroad. We paused in the parking lot, now thoroughly sketched out, and not too sure if it was a good idea to go wandering through this dark tunnel alone, when we saw some people further down the parking lot, heading our way, and we began to feel a bit better. Now to our left was the tracks, and to our right was the road, but between us and the road was a very steep embankment, full of dense trees, on the other side of a chain-link fence. Before we could get onto the tracks, we heard something slide down the embankment. We froze and locked eyes on where the noise had come from. The tussling of leaves continued faintly, but by this point we assumed it was a squirrel or some other animal. That was until the rustling grew in volume, and it became apparent this was no animal, but a human. It had come down the steep bank and was now at the chain-link fence. We could hear distinct footsteps and rustling that would be impossible for any animal native to the city to make. We backed away quickly from the entrance of the tracks and stared in horror as we both came to the realization that this was a person making their way along the fence. We saw the people who had been coming towards us earlier reach where we were standing, thankful someone else was around. They, however, continued to the hole in the fence and crawled through, seeming not to hear the loud thuds and rustling creeping along the fence. Now keep in mind, my friend was high, and I was definitely not sober, but not anywhere near a point where I didn't have a decent judgment. My friend didn't want to be alone in the parking lot, so she suggested following the people. But said people were a group of 5 to 6 frat guys in a dark tunnel of trees, so I vetoed that notion. She still wanted to get into the trees though, so we could finish smoking our wormwood out of the view of the public. But at this point I wasn't keen on being anywhere no one could see us. The rustling and footsteps were still louder than ever. We spotted another group of people coming our way. This group too passed us and went through the hole, paying no mind to whoever was lost in the bushes right next to them. We then both had the idea that we possibly were hallucinating, but none of the substances we were currently on had hard evidence of being able to cause something like that. And we were both hearing it, clear as day. There was someone over there, the chain-link fence was jingling, and there were footsteps. At this point we had been standing there for almost 10 minutes, this noise continuing the entire time. We both came to the conclusion that it was just someone trying to get high in peace like we were, and dove through the hole and went the opposite direction the other people had gone, opting to sit on a bridge instead. We could still hear the jingling of the fence behind us, and crunch of dry leaves, but tried to ignore it while keeping an eye out for anyone going through the hole. We saw nothing though, and we still couldn't build up the courage to go back that way, and ended up wandering around for another hour, trying to find our way back to the dorm and avoid whoever had been rummaging around in the leaves for 20 minutes. It's kind of an anticlimactic story, I know, but still was absolutely terrifying at the time. We went back to that area in the morning, and the hill was steep. It was basically a 90-degree angle and completely surrounded by 6-foot chain-link fence, so it's really concerning that someone was down there in the first place. Also, that no one else was even slightly alarmed by the commotion. Maybe we really were just hearing things. In August 2019, I loaded a bunch of camping gear onto my bicycle and spent the better part of the next 7 months riding 5,300 miles around the US. I often preferred to wild camp, so rather than staying in proper campgrounds, I would just find a place to disappear into the woods for the night. In late September, I was wild camping somewhere in rural Montana. I was quite a ways out there, far from the nearest town, and I went off into the woods and set up camp. After using the last few minutes of sunlight to eat some dinner, brush my teeth, and write in my journal, I laid down to get some sleep. Now, over the past month or so of sleeping in the woods, I had grown very accustomed to the nighttime sounds of the forest. The chirping of crickets and croaking of toads can be quite loud. There was always at least a slight breeze rustling the leaves of trees, too. It was always a highlight of my night, though not particularly uncommon, to hear the distant yips and howls of coyotes, and one night I was very excited to hear 2 owls, one on either side of my tent, hooting back and forth. So that one night in Montana, it was quite alarming to be surrounded by a completely silent forest. There was not a single sound to be heard. Even the air was dead still, with no breeze to rustle the dry leaves of autumn still clinging to the trees, and it was honestly terrifying. On that night there would occasionally be the snapping of a twig, or some other such sound that normally would be lost in the other commotion. But that night there was no background noise to mask the few sounds that did pop up, and so all of those little twig-snapping type things seemed 100 times louder. On that trip I slept in some very loud places, like the night I pitched my tent right next to some train tracks that ended up being much more active than I thought. I shared a hostel room with a guy who snored, and a bunkmate who talked in his sleep, both in the same night. But that night of absolute silence in the woods of Montana was the worst night's sleep of the entire 179-day trip. It was the loudest silence I've ever heard, and that absolutely terrified me. My horse Trigger was a beautiful Arabian stallion, and I had been riding horses since I was a little girl. My father always kept horses, and my sisters and I grew up learning to live with these magnificent animals. Trigger was a wedding gift from my husband. He had also chosen the name. Trigger was beautiful, and we bonded instantly, and I had raised him from the time he was just a foal. He had a calm temperament for an Arabian, which was rare for that particular breed. But there was something special about Trigger. He had such a personality, always hanging his head over his stall door looking for attention. He had an endearing kindness in his eyes, and was so attentive and easy to train, and I never passed up an opportunity to spend time with him. Now, we were out in the Gila National Forest one September afternoon. Gila was one of the most beautiful places in all of New Mexico, and hasn't changed much in the last century. It was stunning diverse terrain, with natural hot springs, native cliff dwellings, and beautiful mountains to watch the sunset. I learned to ride in this place. I had so many memories here. So many days spent out here with my father and sisters, and as a little girl, I always pretended we were pioneers out on the frontier. It was silly. But my father passed away the year before I got married, and all 3 of my sisters moved out of state years ago. We didn't keep in touch that much. It was just me now. "I miss you, Daddy," I said out loud. Trigger neighed quietly, and it snapped me out of my trance. The sun was beginning to set, and it was time to go home. As we trotted along on the trail, Trigger began to act strange. He was snorting loudly and raising his head and tail. I tried to calm him, but he started squealing and making sounds I've never heard him make before. He was bucking wildly now, with such violence I couldn't hold on. It all happened so fast. I was thrown to the ground, and I looked up at him with my face full of tears, when I saw what he was seeing, and what he was sensing. It was up ahead, and had just crested the hill. I could hardly make it out at first, and I wiped the tears from my eyes, trying to focus on what this thing was. Was it a dog? No, it was a coyote, a considerably large coyote. But something was wrong with it. It walked with an awkward gait, like it couldn't move its legs properly. It reminded me of a newborn baby learning to crawl. It would move one paw forward at a time, and it moved like an old animatronic puppet. It was sickly looking, with matted fur and dark eyes that seemed utterly black, and there was no reflection of light in its eyes at all. Trigger was bucking and snorting viciously now, and what happened next was terrifying and surreal. The coyote raised to 2 legs, and was now standing straight up on its hinds. It opened its mouth wide, much wider than normal, almost as if the jaw was broken the way it just opened and hung down. The sound that came from its mouth still haunts me to this day, a droning, soulless wail. It sounded like so many things at once, an amalgamation of different creatures' cries of agony. Trigger bolted straight at it, its hooves pounding into the ground like a freight train. I don't know if the thing tried to move or not, but Trigger trampled over it like a bulldozer. The coyote's misshapen body was crushed under the horse's weight, its sinewy limbs twisted and broken. Trigger circled back around as the coyote began to slowly reform and attempt to stand up. Trigger reared up, came crashing down again, and the coyote never made a sound of pain. It never cried out or whimpered. It only continued to make that horrifying droning sound. Trigger kicked its rear legs violently and sent the nightmare creature flying off the trail. I couldn't hear it anymore, that sound. Trigger then came towards me, and I knew what to do. I jumped on his back, and he broke out into a full-on gallop, flying down the path, and never slowed until we saw the lights of the ranch. My husband was on the porch waiting for me, as he knew something was wrong. I could barely speak as I recounted the terrifying events to him. Trigger stood silently in the background. His sweet and caring personality had returned. I don't know what that thing in the woods was, but I know my horse had saved me. There was something special about Trigger. This is a story that my mother and aunts told me when I was in high school. I'm 21 now, and I've never forgotten it, and I think about it constantly and ponder over what had happened. My grandfather passed close to a year ago, in June 2020. He was 96 when he died, and it caused some issues in my family. This doesn't really pertain to the story, but there are some things about him that I have to share. My grandfather, John, was a man who was extremely calloused and old-fashioned. He was bitter, abusive, and a macho man. My mother was raised on never showing emotion or pain due to his abuse and lack of compassion for others, and he was also an extreme racist. He had many secrets kept within my family that are now coming to light since he'd passed. Everything that happened around him was brushed off and forgotten because he had more important things to do, like drinking and having affairs. He was just an overall intense and very no-nonsense type of man, was not religious at all, and found things like faith and hope stupid. Now this took place sometime in the early to mid-70s. My mum was born in 1965 and remembers it clearly. My aunts as well remember this happening, but no one knows exactly what year. One summer day, John decided to take his family on a small outing, with the intent to have a picnic in the woods. My mother, her 3 sisters, and her mother, my grandmother, were all there and very excited about it. Where we are from, my family is more than accustomed to the woods and has lived in this area for generations, so going there for a fun family activity was nothing out of the ordinary and seemed to be just another normal day. They made their way down a backwoods dirt road and stopped once they'd found a clearing large enough to accommodate them. As all the kids started jumping out of the car and messing around as kids do after being stuck together, my grandmother began unloading their food and picnic supplies. John began surveying the area and deciding where to set up, and as he was doing so, something in the woods past the clearing caught his eye. Before going to see what was out there, he yelled to the family and said he would be right back. The kids and my grandmother thought nothing of this, since they were all used to the woods, and these woods in particular. They continued unloading and setting up the stuff they'd brought, when one of the girls pointed out something in the clearing that caused a sudden shift from a normal day to something far worse. It was a dirt mound that looked like something was buried under it. This mound was about the size of a small person, maybe even child size. It was too big to simply be an animal in the woods. There was nothing but squirrels and raccoons in the area. Scattered amongst the mound were large river rocks. There was no pattern, but they were definitely placed on the mound intentionally. Also, the dirt seemed to be fresh, as though just buried. It was loose and slightly darker than the area around it. The mood then immediately shifted from an average day in the woods to something much darker. My grandmother became concerned and told the girls to stay away from it. She was clearly upset and worried about it, but did her best to ignore it. The girls, all being children, didn't have the same amount of worry and continued playing whilst just avoiding the mound. They tried to return to their picnic, and the girls were already chasing each other in circles again. It was supposed to be a joyous sunny day, and my grandmother wanted to keep it that way. Things seemed to return to normal for a beat. The trees around them created a wall of dense foliage, blocking their view from anything inside the forest, when one of the girls again took notice of something strange, and it was clear immediately what it was. Along one of the long branches of the tree hung a noose. It was tied with rope and hung high above their heads. A lump of dirt can be explained away by nature, but someone had to have placed the noose there. My grandmother stopped dead in her tracks when she saw it. Something was wrong. Very, very wrong. They couldn't just pack up and leave. John was still out in the woods. Even children can recognize a noose as a symbol of death. And the children started to become very anxious. Whatever innocence was keeping them from worrying about the mound had completely vanished now. My grandmother, the resilient woman she is, soothed her children and told them it was just left by deer hunters. But she knew in her heart they needed to leave. No deer hunter would hang a deer and then bury it. At least no sane deer hunter. It wasn't until they started hearing something in the woods that they began to really panic. My grandmother, as well as the children, began hearing a rhythmic chanting from deep in the woods. It sounded as though there was a group of people all singing in deep voices to the beat of a drum. it went in a quick pattern, 3 steady beats followed by a pause, and then it would repeat. It sounded far away, but immediately fear began to take hold of each of them. They listened and gathered together, and as the seconds passed it began to increase in volume. It was getting not just louder, but closer. What started out as a distant echo soon began to engulf the entire clearing. My grandmother was terrified and wanted so desperately to leave, but John had yet to return. They waited, fear-ridden, as the sound began to fill their chests. It felt like they were at a concert, as the deep bass began to vibrate them. It was everywhere and constant, as though the sound was being made by the trees themselves, surrounding the family in every direction. Suddenly, the sound of yelling broke through the constant drone of chanting. John's voice was yelling out to them from the trees. "Go! Get in the car!" He came running out of the woods, yelling that they needed to leave. They had never seen terror on this man, as they had at this moment. He was afraid of nothing, unbothered by the world around him. And this was the most emotion any of them had ever seen from him. He saw something in those woods, something that shook his very being to the core. My grandmother began throwing everything back in the car as the kids got in as well. John and my grandmother picked up their things and as quickly as possible threw it all into the car. They had no care for the things they were packing up due to their fear. Food was all over the trunk, and items were broken. After everything was tossed in, they both got in the car and drove away. This is where the main grunt of the story ends. But one fact from this story is what really has caused me to wonder all these years. My grandfather had refused to ever speak of what he saw. He never told any of the children, or my grandmother, and every time this was brought up, he quickly rebuffed it and angrily told them not to ask again. He never went to the police or told someone outside of the family. My grandfather is the only person who knows what happened that day, and when I first heard the story, I swore to myself I would ask him one day. But now I can't, and regret it greatly. By the time I was in high school, he had moved out of the state with other family members, and I mostly lost contact with him outside of occasional happy birthday calls or letters. This story doesn't have an answer to go with it. When he died, the only thing I was sad about was never knowing what happened that day. We weren't close when I got older, and once I learned of all the abuse he'd caused, I separated myself from him. His death looms over me, and this story still haunts me to this day. My mother and aunts just look back on it as a spooky memory from their childhood, nothing more than a story to spook the little ones at Thanksgiving with. I am the only one of the family who is still curious about what happened, as I have always been interested in mysteries, the occult, horror and conspiracy theories. This particular story piqued my interest more than any others in my family, which, by the way, isn't the only strange story from my family, but it definitely is the most strange. I wish I had answers. I want to begin by clarifying that the majority of this post is a prelude to my actual upcoming amateur investigation. What I'll be documenting in this post is essentially a compilation of stories I've been told, some retellings of others, and also what little I've already checked out myself. I will not claim validity to any of the accounts I'm about to give you. All I can be certain of is that I trust dearly the person from which I continue to get a lot of these stories, as they are the mother of a close friend I've known for over 10 years. Honestly, some of this stuff gets a little weird for belief, but I intend to put that to the test however I can, soon. The place I call my hometown, and current town, is a Kentucky county comprised of old coal mining towns that at one time had a bustling economy. Let's call it Arling. Unfortunately, coal mining died a slow and painful death, and so has my home. This saddens me greatly. Arling is one of the most beautiful places I've ever seen, nestled into the heart of one of the oldest mountain ranges on Earth. The Appalachian Mountains have a tangible natural spirit to them, and I also believe they are host to a variety of things we do not understand. I, along with my girlfriend and roommate, often hike on old trails around the county in hopes of finding interesting sights to see, and we are always looking for somewhere neat to hike far out in the sticks. I had a friend of mine who asked some of his work buddies if they knew of any rural pathways to test out. One of them mentioned that his father had hiked a path ascending a mountain beside what we call the Old Lake, and that the place scared him to death. The Old Lake is part of a forsaken wildlife management area, about 10 miles outside of town toward the state lines, at the base of Mount Mason. The government property lines only go so far. Beyond that is private land owned by a local wealthy family, presumably abandoned as well. The man's father told of how he had once hiked along the ascending trail that follows the creek from the lake and up into the mountains past the WMA boundaries. I will refer to this trail as Lonesome Creek. The man crested a hill and prepared to briefly rest upon a flat spot, when he quickly took notice of a shady campsite that had evidently been set up on the flat for some time. The site was unremarkable at first glance, nothing there but a fire pit surrounded by wooden chairs, but he could just barely see something else beyond the tree line. It looked as though someone haphazardly poked big sticks into the surrounding forest. A closer look revealed that what he was looking at were pikes, staked into the dirt and adorned with severed cat heads. The man's hair raised up as he felt something out there put its eyes on him, and he quickly put distance between himself and Lonesome Creek, and never again so much as visited the old lake. After hearing this story, it dawned on me that I had been told something similar years ago. This story, too, implied possible ritualistic activity on Mount Mason, and as it goes, a mutual friend and his cousin had taken their ATVs on Lonesome Creek that night. Sometime into their ride, the pair spotted a makeshift seating area right in the middle of the trail. It was shabbily constructed, with a few chairs as well as an altar. Even more frightening was a recently doused fire in front of the altar. Someone had been there just before they arrived. The two riders killed their engines and unseated themselves, looking around the ridge with their flashlights. As the silence soaked in, they could make out faint voices just beyond some trees on a steep incline near the ridge. Needless to say, they didn't bother shining their lights and left in a hurry, and probed no further. Remembering this incident was enough to have me look deeper into this harrowing mystery. The occult aspect of Appalachia has always intrigued me. Everything from folk magic to the blackest of practices pervades the history of the hill folk and their predominantly Scottish-Irish ancestors whom emigrated long ago. In the spirit of curiosity, my girlfriend and I took a midday ride up to the backside of the old lake, opposite from the dockside, where families boat and fish. The road was in rough shape, and upon arrival it was obvious from the massive amount of trash that the Department of Fish and Wildlife had long abandoned this WMA. We walked up the seemingly well-travelled path against the downward stream of the titular creek, and after reaching the marked end of the WMA, which was about 0.5 miles, we decided it was wise to go no further. The sheer seclusion of the place pulled me in, but I needed to take time to plan carefully and gather up a few willing folks to walk along the old Lonesome Creek trail. A quick check of Google Maps confirmed the garbage-ridden lakeside to indeed be the bottom of the trail. The path appeared to follow the creek up to a massive rocky ridge that wraps around the side of Mount Mason, leading to an overview of the newer, larger lake a few miles over. Finding out where to go was simple enough, I suspected, though, that getting there would not be as such. The following Saturday, I managed to gather and prepare 4 of my friends with which to set out to the old lake. 2 of us came with firearms, the other 2 brought knives and mace, and confident yet anxious, we left the dirty lakeside and headed up parallel to the creek. The lower part of the trail was lined with large jutting rocks that formed caves below and continued up the mountainside. These enormous jagged pieces seemed to have fallen long ago from the massive ridge above, which topped Mount Mason like a crown. Past the caves and closer to the lowest part of the ridge, the trail aligned into a rocky old creek bed, now diverted and empty. We stopped to rest at the bottom of a switchback, now at high enough elevation to be cradled by a lower portion of the ridge overhanging the trail's connecting elbow. After some respite under the stone's shade, we began our ascent to the top. The path soon wound away from the creek and continued to repeatedly switch back and forth up the side of a steep, stunningly green hill. Studded into the landscape were small scattered stones, lain upon long fallen trees, all covered in moss of a believably ancient colour. From this point on, the trail was faint but identifiable, and despite the trash at the trailhead, this high-up forest looked absolutely untouched. After mounting the hill, we wound through thick growth made of a tree I have never seen. Low-hanging branches of a round profile surrounded the thin trunk, appearing like a cross between a weeping willow and an acorn tree. Besides that, there were quite a few other types of foliage I had never seen before, and I may take photos on my return. Once atop the hill, we finally checked in on Google Maps to see how far along the trail we were. But to our dismay, we were pinpointed way off the trail on the map. And this startled me, considering there was only one visible trail along the whole path. What was even more startling is that we ended up on a trail not listed by Gmaps. Admittedly, this wasn't too worrisome, since the pathway was fairly defined, despite not seeing much action. We assessed that we should make the best of the situation anyway, and press on a little further to make good use of the remaining daylight. Gmaps showed that we were near a rock-crawling ATV tourist attraction on the state line called Hole in the Rock, a wagon tunnel that cut through the mountain's crown near the top. However, the last and only check-in for the area was 5 years prior. Apparently we had found ourselves on an old wagon trail, stretching from our side through the tunnel and into the next on the other side. The place was old for sure. Exciting was the notion of trekking through an archaic commerce road, passing over the old Native American land of Mount Mason, and it was interesting stuff. We resolved to find the wagon tunnel and descend before dark, but we didn't make it there in time before having to turn around. I'll go ahead and tell you that nothing exciting happened, about which I am both disappointed and relieved. After hiking back down without incident as expected, we left behind the old lake. It was hard not to dwell upon the chilling isolation felt at Lonesome Creek. The land was empty and quiet, not at all marred by frequent travel, and I'm deadly serious when I tell you that this place had a very different energy than your typical nature trail. It evoked an unsettling combination of serenity and oppression, and I found it to be the perfect place for strangeness in the primordial wilderness. Lonesome Creek seemed as isolated from the rest of Arling as Appalachia is to the rest of America. It can be easily ascertained that isolation of the spirit would certainly breed desolation of the soul. Yesterday, I rang up a lady, we will call her Marla, whom I have known for quite a long time. Marla has been investigating the weird and wild for almost 20 years and has written a few books about local Kentucky myths, folklore, and paranormal stories. She has, with her own resources, even helped find the identity of an early 20th century cold case victim. Conveniently enough, it just also happens that she and her family live about a mile from the old lake. So I knew if anyone could point me to something, it would be Marla. To be quite honest, I didn't expect the volume or magnitude of some of the things she told me on that phone call. I have no bias towards the truth of the 2 stories I've already recounted, but this is different to me. I believe this woman with everything in me, and I don't consider myself naive. I will relay to you the information she has given me, which consists of her own experiences, as well as the accounts of her family members. I will do my best to tell them faithfully. When Marla married and moved to the old Lake Road, it seemed nice enough, rural and quiet. She had her first child in 1993, who would grow up to be one of my best friends. When he was barely a toddler, his maternal and paternal grandfathers often took him into the woods across the road from their house, through their family cemetery, and up a long dirt path. One day Marla received a call from her father, asking her to tell her father-in-law, who lived on the same property as Marla and her husband, not to take her son into the mountains that day. He said he'd seen some strange folk camping up there who seemed a little suspect. Her father must have been pretty concerned, because later that evening, the state police showed up at the cemetery. The authorities informed Marla that they had to run off some people up on the mountain that appeared to be trying to set up a site to regularly meet and loiter for whatever purpose. Before leaving the cemetery, the policeman she was speaking to told her plainly, "Between me and you, they were doing some strange things up there." When pressed, he would not say. He'd just shake his head and decline to answer. About a year later, Marla got the gall to go with her husband up to where the police ran off the loitering creeps. She claims to have found small animal bones scattered around a clearly once established site, and a concrete slab fitted into the dirt and etched with what she described as obviously evil symbology. This was a time before cell phones, so she has no photo evidence. Side note, she has also given me permission to check out the area, so I may have something tangible for that in the inevitable update post. The next weird experience to befall Marla did not come for almost 6 years. It seemed to have spooked her more than anything else she has told me. One evening, Marla thought it would be fun to take her son, then age 7, on a walk to the old lake to check out the creek, catch salamanders and find rocks as they often did along the river, which runs behind their property. They made their way to the lake and followed Lonesome Creek up towards the initial incline and past the marked WMA area. Apart from the creek babble, Marla caught ear of what sounded like loud voices further into the woods. As she and her son continued up to face the second incline, it became evident that a group of people were gathered toward Mason's Crown. A loud voice echoed from above, booming and fervent like that of a typical southern preacher. The voice spoke rapidly and was periodically answered by a group of voices which spoke in unison. Marla and her son listened closely. The chanting began to cease and everything fell quiet. The eerie silence was broken by the man's booming voice, angrily shouting in Marla's direction from high atop the ridge. Marla grabbed her son and ran all the way back down to the trailhead, fearing that whoever gathered there had seen her and was warding her off. Like the others, she's never since been back to Lonesome Creek. Years after her experience with the chanting voices, Marla recounted a time her father and father-in-law had been part of something unexplainable when traveling the trail from the Kentucky side of Mount Mason. Though they followed a path that both had walked many times before, the two men became disorientated and got lost. Marla's father said that an anxious feeling washed over him, and suddenly it was as if they simply were somewhere else entirely. They made it home unharmed in an amount of time they described as unusually short, but were never able to explain the event. It was later realized that they had somehow ended up on the other side of the state line on Mount Mason, way out there, and this was not her only account of this phenomenon. Just 2 years after the incident her father had described, 2 fish and wildlife officials showed up at her house in the middle of basically nowhere. The men admitted that they had no clue where they were, and they told Marla that they were trying to get to their destination on the neighbor state side, but somehow became lost and ended up on the Kentucky side. I find it unsettling that despite having maps and being otherwise familiar with their territory, they ended up miles and miles off track. Marla noted that they were visibly shaken by the experience, and as time has crept almost 20 years past, Marla has searched for answers to her experiences, but has found few. The only presumption she has gleaned is that there have been unexplainable forces in these mountains since they were settled, and probably long before. Appalachia is closely tied with various oddities and old traditions, both good and bad. Benign covens of witches, yet existent within unbroken bloodlines. Wannabe satanic sects composed of lunatics who gain pleasure through infliction of suffering. Old secret societies, once prominent, but that have since died with coal country's prosperous town dotted across rural Appalachia. There is much to be uncovered, and there is even more that should be altogether left alone. If you think about it for a moment, this sort of place really is a perfect hiding place for things of darker nature, an isolated mountain range with an ancient soul, wherein you can find whatever old secrets you may be looking for. My dilemma is, though, whether or not trying to find them is a good idea. The things I've written are the only bits of information that Marla has given me that are relevant to the ill air at Lonesome Creek and Mount Mason. There is much more that she has shared with me regarding other areas in Arling and surrounding counties that I will share within the next week or so. I fully intend on going back to follow the stream of Lonesome Creek itself and up the mountain and onto that ridge. I want to be fully prepared to investigate the secrets of the creepy old wagon trail, where dark things surely take place. Interestingly enough, I have discovered that a wealthy, old family in Arling owns the suspect property along the ridge. Maybe next time we will find the path to get there. I'm a male, and when I was 16 I met up with two friends to go shopping at our local mall. After shopping for a while, we decided to head to the beach at about 4 p.m. The beach and the mall are separated by a large forest, with only walking paths, and my friend decided we should smoke some of his weed. So we dipped off the main walking trail and walked through a very slim path that very few people know about. It's a 5 to 10 minute walk on this overgrown path that widens to a small clearing where we decided to spark up. As we continued to smoke, my friend pointed out a jacket about 20 feet away on the ground. As I walked towards it, I realized there were a pair of pants connected to the jacket, and it looked like a human figure. But since it was pitch black out and we were high as hell, we moved closer and could finally see it actually was a human shape. It had a hat that covered its face, and as we were so close to a mall, we laughed thinking someone had stolen a mannequin. The only exposed part of the body was a hand, and it was so white we were convinced it was porcelain. But afterwards we quickly realized mannequins generally don't have shoes, and the clothes that he had on were clearly outdated. You guessed it. 3 stone teens in a dark forest with a dead guy. We were freaking out, but us being high weren't sure what it was and had to double check. A friend and I grabbed a stick and together we poked it. The thing moved like jello, and we instantly all sprinted out of the forest and back to the mall. We stupidly didn't report it and went home. The next day we brought another friend and went back to it. In the daylight it became pretty clear that it definitely was a body. We removed the hat and found a decomposing human face. We then called the police immediately and all got interrogated separately at the station, but we never said anything about the initial finding of the body the day before. So I had a date several years ago with this dude I met online, and I really should have paid attention to the red flags. This guy had no sense of humor and wouldn't type so much as an LOL or a smiley face when I tried to joke with him. He seemed kind of serious, but he had a lot of intriguing things to say, and we had a lot of the same interests, so I figured maybe he would be better in person. But no. After some creepy encounters I've had in the past, I made sure to message one of my best girlfriends before going out on a date with him. I told her where we were going, the car he drove, and his name. I even sent her a pic of his profile online. Anyway, on to the date. I met him at a restaurant that happened to be next to a hiking trail. Weird, I know. Well, during our time eating, his sense of humor had not appeared at all. It was really creepy. Like every time I made a joke or laughed, he would just stop what he was doing and stare right through me at nothing. His eyes resembled the cold, emotionless eyes of a doll, and it creeped me the hell out. Then he started talking and it got worse. He started talking about his job, how he felt slighted by everyone, and that he deserved to be treated better because he was smarter than them. Serious psychopath red flags were going off in my head, and he still had no emotion on his face. No smile, no laugh. Just a constant blank face and blank stare with those predatory eyes. But then, he said he wanted to go for a hike. Oh God. I said I needed to go to the bathroom. I told my friend everything via phone call, and she was to make up a story to allow me to ditch the date. I should have just crawled out of the window and left, but I didn't want to be rude, and I just felt bad. My friend was going to call me in 10 minutes with her story, and we started down the hiking trail. There were plenty of people around, so I relaxed for a bit. But then, he kept trying to take me off trail to look at a great spot that he'd found when he was there earlier. He had been off the trail here before, and I panicked, sent my friend an SOS, and she called with the story that her car had broken down, or something like it, and needed me to get her. The dude wasn't buying it though, and insisted on meeting my friend. We both drove to the restaurant separately, so why would he need to meet my friend? He became frustrated and a little angry. The first emotion I had ever seen on his face. I rushed back up the trail where I could be seen, and the anger on his face vanished. He decided to stay where he was in the trail, and thankfully didn't see me off when I left. I don't know if this dude was truly dangerous or not, but the feeling in the pit of my stomach told me to get the hell out of there. Do you think I was jumping the gun? This happened about 5 or 6 years ago, when me and my friends were freshmen in high school. We frequently went into the woods near our school that had some abandoned structures in it. Sometimes we went in there to smoke, graffiti, or just otherwise explore. It was always a pretty fun time, and on a fall day after school, we decided to go exploring there, as we would usually do. For the first 10 or 15 minutes into our adventure, everything was normal, until we eventually came across a tree that had a dagger sticking out of it. I immediately got a horrible feeling, and one of my friends, Nathan, went over to the tree and took the dagger out, and sure enough it was 100% real. I'm not exactly sure what I was thinking, but part of me was hoping it was some sort of gag toy. We all just kind of looked at each other, a little weirded out, but ultimately didn't think much of it. We thought maybe someone had left it there to mess with whoever came across it. That's what we were all hoping for anyway. But Nathan put the dagger in his backpack, and off we went. It wasn't long after we came across that tree that things started to get weird, and I was the first to notice it. I could see there was a man, all in black, following us, keeping a good distance away. He was always to the right of us, hiding behind some trees, and from what I could see, he looked to be an average height, wearing a black hoodie, black jeans and black boots. I wanted to leave the second I saw him, but when I told my friends what I had seen, I don't think any of them believed me. They just kind of laughed it off. Either way, they thought I was seeing things, or they thought someone was just messing with us and didn't feel threatened by it. Once we were about 40 minutes into the woods, we finally saw him, and this time he was a lot closer, at about 30 feet away. I still couldn't make out much detail about his face, because he had his hood on and his head down, although I could see he was wearing a white t-shirt underneath his hoodie. Everyone froze for a brief moment. There were 4 of us, and we just stared, not really sure what to do with the situation. Everyone stood in silence for about 3 very long, very scary seconds, until he ran farther back into the woods behind some trees, until we couldn't see him anymore. I grabbed onto Nathan's arm, who was the closest to me, and said, "We have to go. Now." I had a horrible pit in my stomach. At first we made our way back to the entrance of the woods at a jogging pace. I think we were all trying to downplay the experience in our minds, not to invoke pure fear and panic. We kept that pace for a minute or 2, until we heard leaves crunching and sticks breaking behind us. We turned around and there he was, trailing us. We started running, and he started chasing us. I was the one behind the group, so the man was closest to me, and I could hear his heavy breathing. That's how close he was. We picked up our speed, and I thought for sure I was going to pass out, because I was fairly out of shape. But luckily we made it in about 25 minutes, stopping once or twice to catch our breath when the man wasn't in sight. Once we all got out, we just kind of looked at each other, trying to figure out what the hell had just happened. We didn't talk about it much after that, and I don't think any of us wanted to think about it for too long. Looking back on it now, we probably should have reported it to the police, in case that man tried to hurt any other innocent kids going into those woods. But unfortunately the thought didn't cross our minds. I don't know if it was him who placed that dagger in the tree, or why it was there. And honestly, I don't want to think about it. I don't know why he was there, or what his intentions were. I'm just glad we got away, and I hope he hasn't hurt or tried to hurt anyone since. Back in 2016, my friends and I, for the longest time, had been itching to go camping at our local site in the Los Padres National Park in Southern California. When we found the perfect weekend to go that didn't interfere with any of our work schedules, we set a date. 3 days before the trip, we found out we were going to get hit by the El Niño rainstorm. So us, being the type of dudes that we are, didn't care if we got hit by the storm whilst camping. So we packed up our cars and made the 45-minute drive to the campsite. It was a family-friendly one, where there were about 100 camping lots that circled around the clearing in the forest. We found the perfect spot that was underneath huge, thick trees that would help block as much rain as possible, and it helped that the restrooms were only 30 yards away too. As soon as we got to our spot, we took advantage of the afternoon sky being cleared for the moment, and we rushed to set up our site. We pitched our tents close to each other, where our tent doors were only 6 feet apart. The reason we did this was in order to combat the rain. I'd brought a 30-foot by 30 thick blue canopy tarp that I threw over to cover us from the rain above, and from the rain that would be running through the ground. It was a genius move on my part. But whenever you would walk around our tent, you would make a lot of noise from crunching and plastic tarp. Hours passed, and we were all around the campfire. It was late into the evening, and this was the first time that I'd noticed that there were barely any other campers around. They were mainly camping in their RVs, like the fake campers they were, and in my honest opinion, they were the smart ones, unlike my friends and I, that were sleeping in 2 small tents, with our only protection being the blue tarp. I was getting tired from a long day of work, so I decided that I was going to bed. My friends followed my lead as well, and I had my friend Ray sleeping in my tent, and AJ and S were sleeping in theirs. But before I called it a night, I whispered to Ray to tell him that I'm going to prank caller S and AJ, but I'm not going to say anything. Ray smiled as I dialed my friends up, and I'd called them restricting my number. S's phone started to ring, and both of them, being the way that they are, became worried very easily as they said to one another, "Who's calling you this late at night?" "I don't know. They called me on restricted." "Are you going to answer?" "Of course not." Ray and I were holding in our laughter as they ignored our call, so I decided to do it one more time. Once their phone started to ring, they started to freak out once again and said, "Who is it this time?" "Same person, I think. I'm going to answer." As they answered, S said in a very shaky tone, "Hello?" Ray and I had to hold in our laughter as we kept as quiet as possible, not wanting to make any noises that would give off that it was us. I held the phone close to my mouth as I began to breathe heavily in a murderous way. Then I ended the call and heard them freaking out. It was hilarious. Now, me being the idiot that I am, called them once more, and this time S picked up the phone immediately and said in a tough voice, "Look, whoever this is, you better stop. I'm about to call the cops if you keep on calling. This is not a threat." Ray and I looked at one another as we at the same time began to fake moan loudly and immediately started to bawl out in laughter. AJ and S were so mad at us for pulling this prank on them, and they were cursing us out. Me, finally calming down from laughing so hard, told the boys good night and said I'd have pancakes ready in the morning. I fell asleep relatively easily, and I was out in a matter of minutes, whilst Ray, AJ and S were up for a while longer. I was the first of my friends to wake up in the morning, and as I'd promised, I had the pancakes already cooking by the time that anyone else woke up. The smell of me cooking woke up my friends, and one by one they got out their tents. As we were eating, AJ spoke up and said, "Hey Jay, the prank that you pulled last night went a little too far." "Yeah, you had us ready to run to our car and take off." Me, feeling a little bit guilty, apologized and said, "Sorry guys, my bad." "Yeah, it's one thing to prank call us like that, but then to walk around our tent and then go inside it in the middle of the night is totally over the limit," S said. Me, not knowing what they were talking about, then said, "What do you guys mean? Come on, still with the jokes. You were the one that was walking around our tent and you walked in." Ray then spoke up and said, "That wasn't Jay who was walking around. I thought that was you two getting your revenge on us for scaring you." "That wasn't us doing that, it was you two." So to explain, after I'd fallen asleep, about an hour had passed where Ray, S and AJ were still up, and all was quiet in the forest, until the sounds of footsteps were heard stepping on our blue tarp that was on the ground. At first my friends thought it could have just been a forest animal wandering round, but the heavy footsteps were a dead giveaway that it was a person. As they described, the person was walking all around our tents, making constant figure eights. The person would place their fingers on the tent's fabric walls to run them up and down, and when the footsteps finally stopped after a couple of minutes, right in between our tent doors. The three of them were already having their hearts pounding out of their chest, and it was silent for a long minute, until the sound of the tent zipper being slid open was heard. As AJ said, the tent's door was only opened halfway, but it was too dark to see anything clearly. But in the darkness, both S and AJ saw the silhouette of a man's face pop his head into the tent to look at both of them. AJ and S faked being asleep the entire time, but they kept their eyes locked onto the man. The man then opened the tent fully and walked inside the tent and just stood at the entrance. The man didn't say a word or do anything, just watched the both of them laying in their sleeping bags. After their longest minute ever, the man stepped out of the tent and they heard him disappear into the night. The entire time that this was happening, S and AJ thought it was either me or Ray doing this, and Ray thought it was AJ or S. So coming back to us, arguing back and forth at the breakfast table, we were interrupted by a man walking over to our campsite. He said, "Good morning, boys. How did the four of you sleep last night?" The man spoke in a voice that sounded as if he'd been smoking for all of his 45 years of being alive. He wore a dirty, sweat-stained white t-shirt that looked more grey at this point, and his blue jeans looked as if they had never been taken off. He smelt of liquor, which isn't a good sign at 8 in the morning, and his words were just mumbles. We didn't say a word to him. When then he asked us if we had any cigarettes to spare. I said that we didn't smoke, and he said, "Oh well, if you boys want to visit me in my RV, just stop by any time." The man continued to walk away, towards the restrooms, and as he was done using it, he walked back to our campsite. He didn't say anything this time, but he looked at us and gave us a nearly toothless smile, and he walked back to his RV. I took note of his RV as it was the only one that stuck out as being dirty and more run down than the others. We quickly summed up the man as the person who was walking around our tents last night, and S and AJ now remembered that they smelt liquor from the person who was standing in their tent. We all agreed that we would keep an extra eye out on this guy, and if he did spend another night, we would most likely report him to the park rangers if he tried anything else. When it was around lunchtime, the man came back, not to use the restroom, but just to talk to us. "So any of you boys interested in buying an RV? You all can go check it out right now and see if you want to buy it. I don't need it anymore, since my wife left me. Just check out the inside of the RV." "No, we're good, sir," I said with a visible threatening tone. The man seemed to notice this and he walked away. The man did end up leaving a few hours before sunset, but the entire time that he was there, he kept glancing at us. The man had his RV about 50 yards away from us, and I noticed that he had a restroom right next to his RV. Why did he make an effort in walking all the way over to our campsite to use our restroom? Also, why did he even use ours if RVs come with restrooms installed in them? Whatever the man wanted, we were just glad that we were about to enjoy the rest of our weekend. This all went down in Kenilworth, Queensland, Australia. My dad grew up on a forestry in Queensland as the son of a forest ranger. My whole life we've spent a lot of time out in that forest, camping and driving through the parts that only rangers would go, and only occasionally. There was one place that Dad loved to take us, and that was a little farm in the middle of the pines that was impossible to find if you didn't know the way. The locals knew the place as Spike's hut, and Spike was a local farmer who had lived there for decades, up until the 90s. Now Spike had a reputation for being abrasive, violent, bigoted, and not concerned with the laws of men. He had a habit of approaching guys in bars who were wearing earrings and tearing them straight out. There were a few stories about people who had displeased him disappearing, so basically Spike was not a nice guy, and his farm and hut reflected that pretty well. Dad would take us out there to camp every time we visited the forestry, and the hut would be more and more dilapidated every time, but the vibe was always the same. That straight-up feeling of being watched, even though Spike had been long gone. As I got older, I became more aware of the signs of life there whenever we'd visit. There would be 44-gallon drums full of smashed beer bottles, and fire pits with reasonably fresh coals. Someone was definitely out there. But God knows why, since the place was literally a snake pit at that point. Despite all this though, Dad didn't seem concerned. One trip we took there when I was a teenager got very strange very quickly. My friends and I were all piled into my dad's 4x4, and we were driving through the bush to Spike's so Dad could tell his scary Spike stories and freak us out. But as we drove onto the property, something immediately caught my eye. Up on the hill opposite Spike's hut, there was what appeared to be a cowboy slumped against a log with his hat over his face and taking a nap. But something about his body position looked unnatural and uncomfortable. It wasn't the way you'd be sat if you were taking a casual nap in the middle of a work day. And even if it was, there was no reason for anyone to be out there. The farm was long defunct, and there was no forest business to be taken care of on the property. I pointed it out to my dad, and instead of letting us out of the car at Spike's as he usually did, he said he wanted to keep driving through the farm to show us something else. He maintained that it was nothing, but that if the figure was still there when we came back through, we'd stop and check it out. Of course, whatever he wanted to show us seemed totally made up, as he just drove us through the forest a bit. And when we came back, I spotted the slumped-over cowboy again, and he hadn't moved an inch. I yelled out to Dad to stop, reminding him of his promise, but instead he acted like he couldn't hear me, locked the truck doors and drove off the farm faster than he'd ever done on those back dirt roads. My friends and I all looked at each other in confusion, but we knew that when it came to this area, questioning my dad was futile at best and dangerous at worst. After then, Dad denied that any of the events of that day had ever happened, but my friends and I were still curious about what was going on out there. So a few months later, we went camping on our own and set out to find Spike's hut. It took hours of driving through the forest to find the gate to Spike's property, but eventually we found it without Dad's help. Something was off as soon as we got there, even more so than usual. My mates jumped out of the car, but were suddenly frozen, not wanting to walk any closer to the hut for no visible reason. The vibe was just wrong, and it felt like we had walked into something that didn't belong to us. The tug in my gut to get out was strong, but I'd spent 2 hours finding the place, and I was going to explore it, goddammit. One of my friends acted brave and walked from the car to the hut with me, quietly acknowledging more and more signs of inhabitants, with knowing nods between us. We said nothing to the others, but we were on high alert. It felt like someone could be back at any minute, or that they had never left and were watching us as we poked around the debris. We walked up to the side of the hut to find a small shed with 3 walls, and I heard my friend's voice go squeaky as he called me over to look inside. On the ground was a huge pile of ashes from what looked like a cooking fire, and confirming this was the presence of a giant makeshift grill, made from cross-hatched wire, sitting over the fire and hinged to the shed wall. As I was looking at this setup, I figured that whoever had been there had been hunting and cooking large chunks of their kill over the fire. Pretty clever, actually. But then my stomach dropped. As my eyes travelled down from the grill to the ground, I saw a baby's sock. Tiny, pink, and terribly out of place. Then another. Then a shirt. Then a ribbon from a child's hair, all sitting right beside the ashes on the ground, next to a woman's weekly Christmas cookbook. That's when the alarm bells in my head went off, and I rounded up my mates to get the hell out of there. Some ranger or crazy old bushie hanging out at that trashed hut was one thing, but there was absolutely no reason for a baby to be out there. And there's no way anything good had come of having a child's clothes right by a huge fire and grill. When we got back to the campground, we couldn't shake the rotten feeling of being watched, and all of us were so unsettled that we packed up our stuff and decided not to stay the night. When I got home, I told my dad about it, and he just shook it off, saying weird stuff happens out there. Being young and dumb, I never thought to look up missing persons in the area, in an attempt to explain either the cowboy or the kid's clothes. But I can tell you I will never make the mistake of going out to Spike's without my father again. Hey, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed my video. And if you did, could you please give me virtual hugs by subscribing and clicking that notifications button. I also have a Patreon page and YouTube channel membership if you'd like to support me further. Thank you again for being here. Keep being creepy.